Tony. I've got a lot to cover here, so I'm going to try and do it as quickly as possible. So it's going to be going at a fair speed. Anybody who kind of thinks that the UFO subject's ancient or dead and buried and not of much popular interest, they need their heads read, because basically over the last few years it's really had a major rebirthing, particularly with the New York Times story, and I'll get into all that. But I've subtitled this actually at the last minute, Murmurations of the UFO Phenomenon, and so I'm just going to go through a quick bit of coincidence or synchronicity. Just a quick background, just to give you an idea of, I know it's a psychic research society and all that kind of stuff, and so one of my earlier backgrounds at the University of New England was I was chairman of the Ghost and Poltergeist subcommittee of the University of New England Psychic Research Society, and so that was basically a catch-all type deal, so we could cover everything, from poltergeists, UFOs, ghosts, all that kind of stuff. Throughout the 70s, I authored a number of articles in a little sort of newsstand magazine called Psychic Australia, and one of the first articles I wrote for it back in 1976-77 was UFOs, the psychic connection. And this paranormal, what we call the paranormal, seems to feature a lot in the UFO subject, so it's certainly a major connection. I previously lectured in this kind of area as well. One of the earlier lectures, which was quite popular, did 3 times in 1 year: UFOs, alien abduction, contact, the parapsychological connection. But I'm only going to use a little bit of that lecture just to refocus. But the coincidence I'm talking about, murmurations. Just earlier in November, in fact about the 1st of November, I completed a review of Jacques Vallée's Forbidden Science journals, and those are really worthwhile books if you can get hold of them. And the one I just did was volume 4, which is the 1990s. These are essentially Jacques Vallée's journals or diaries, and it's really important, the 1990s. For those who don't know, Jacques Vallée is one of the kind of leading researchers in the field, and a friend and associate of Dr. J. Allen Hynek as well for many decades. So quite an innovative researcher, that kind of thing. So the piece I wrote for UFO Truth magazine, which is an online e-magazine from the United Kingdom, was called Forbidden Science, Murmurations of the Invisible College, the Odyssey of Jacques Vallée. The murmuration word I deliberately used. To me it kind of appealed because it kind of gave you an idea of what the Invisible College was all about, and this is this gathering of scientists that were kind of below the radar, doing stuff sub rosa or in secret, more often than not wanting to be too public, etc. And Hynek and Vallée were kind of leaders, or more public than most, and they were kind of I guess a beacon to scientists and researchers worldwide who wanted to study the UFO subject seriously, but were a little concerned about what it might do to their career path, that kind of stuff. So in UFO Truth magazine, I wrote, in conjunction with the earlier volumes of Forbidden Science, we can see important trends in the development of a central thread, namely that Vallée is often describing the ebb and flow of the UFO Invisible College as it develops originally around Dr. Allen Hynek. Quite often it is a somewhat secretive evolution of the Invisible College, in that those with the right connections, academic, military, intelligence and political, are made privy to the fuller complexity and nature of such interactions. Like birds flocking together, sometimes purposely and other times with a lack of cohesion, the concept of murmuration seems to apt in describing the long evolution of such gatherings, coming together, flocking together, focusing, coming apart, often collapsing, and then reforming for a purpose. These can be elusive for the outsiders to follow, and sometimes erratic in their focus. Now, when I wrote that murmuration reference on the 1st of November and sent it across to the UK to put in the magazine, and that's already out, I wasn't sort of expecting any kind of coincidence or synchronicity, but here we go. Just over the last week or so, major coincidences with the concept of murmuration. Now, murmurations that where you see starlings in particular, or other birds flocking together with really magnificent movements. And this one here There's a really beautiful video on YouTube that's worthwhile looking at. It's on National Geographic. And I saw one probably as spectacular as this one. I'm not going to play the video, but you can have a look at it yourself. And there's really millions of birds in these flocks. And this one shows the thing in flight, well and truly established. But then if you looked at the last few seconds of it, you see this black mass sort of going off behind the tree line. And you kind of think if that was the only view you had of it, you might have a UFO sighting, a UFO kind of sighting. But that's what I wasn't particularly interested in, that aspect. Already some sites, there was a new defence project through the US Navy, and it was referring to basically the use of drone swarms. These are small drones the size of swallows and that kind of stuff, small birds, to act as a kind of a major military deterrent. And information about that came out over the last couple of weeks. So in the wake of the reference I was making to Murmurations, they're essentially using large flocks, hundreds of these little dove-like sort of drones to kind of fool the enemy, that kind of stuff, give them the impression that there was an object or an aircraft flying where there wasn't one. And these little drones were highly expendable, so it didn't matter whether they got knocked out of the sky. And they could move and create all sorts of false impressions in the enemy. And that was under the code name of Project Nemesis. Now, earlier this week, and I'm talking Tuesday of this week, Washington DC, the area around the White House, went into a major lockdown security because there was a slow-moving blob, as reported by the CNN, which may have been a flock of birds, caused the White House to shut down. At first they were seeing it as an unidentified aircraft, then they reported it as a drone, and then finally they got around to suggesting that it was maybe a murmuration or a flock of birds. Now, I wasn't kind of expecting that kind of synchronicity to be taking place just while I was preparing my lecture and playing around with the title. But anyway, this is a transcript of the conversation of the intercept pilot. They did send up intercept aircraft to figure out what this slow-moving object was, because it was getting awfully close to the White House and the main heart of Washington DC. And the pilot had the call sign Blackjack, and he did report seeing a flock of birds. He says, we almost hit a flock of birds here at about 1,000 feet, 1,300. Blackjack, can you see the direction they're going? Yeah, they're going north-northwest. The radar operator, it was actually a police radar, the local Washington DC police, and they were the ones that issued the emergency, and I gather it was an older radar system, so that's something they need to shut down, because the whole Nemesis system works really well when you're dealing with sort of older radar systems, and it's a whole new ballgame when you're dealing with new radar systems. Now, what we're talking about is Jacques Vallée. Is the Forbidden Science hardcover edition and the softcover edition. The Invisible College I'm talking about kind of invoked the idea of back in the was it 16th century or thereabouts, the advent of the beginning of the modern sort of era of science, etc. It was really called natural philosophy back in those days, and it was kind of dangerous given the prominence of the church to do anything that was remotely related to science that was sort of outside the domain of the church. So a lot of people that were involved in this natural philosophy, which eventually became science, preferred to do things undercover. And so Hynek and Vallee's group of scientists were often seen as a modern day invisible college. And he wrote a book about it in 1975 called The Invisible College, what a group of scientists has discovered about UFOs' influences on the human race, and that got reissued, perhaps a bit of overkill in the title, but got reissued a year or two later under the name UFOs, the Psychic Solution. Now, Jacques Vallée now, he's in his 70s and he's still active in UFO research. And in terms of kind of the themes I'll be dealing with in this lecture, the paranormal, all that kind of stuff, he's heavily involved in this video that came out of Argentina. And I really recommend you watch this video called Witness of Another World. And it involves the experiences of a well, originally he was a boy at the age of 12, I think, when he had this experience back in 1978. But it was the incredibly profound effect and the paranormal dimensions of it that sort of make it really interesting. And Jacques Vallée visited the site, interviewed the boy back in about 1980, and what's really touching in the film is that they're reunited. Now, whatever the nature of the experience was, it had an absolutely profound effect on the boy, and that's him as an adult now. He literally became a lifelong loner. It really affected him, and it was interesting how they use native and indigenous kind of therapies to basically bring this guy back into his sort of local community. It's a kind of almost a shamanic story, and they also bring Jacques Vallée into the story, and they reunite Jacques Vallée with this young boy that he saw at the age of 12. This is a bit of a montage of the case. This is Jacques Vallée with the boy Juan Perez back in 1980. Jacques Vallée on the right, the boy's father on the left, and the boy himself. When he was describing this, he would break down, and it's a really beautiful film, but also a highly emotional one. It's a really interesting personal journey throughout. And here's Jacques Vallée and Juan Perez, just during the time of the documentary. Here's from Jacques Vallée's files, the nature of the story. Now, it's a really weird story, but they really invoke it well in the documentary, and it shows how Juan Perez was out retrieving some horses on his parents' property. He's riding his horse. There's this strange fog develops. He rides into the fog, sees a craft. The craft lands, and out of there's kind of like a ladder that comes down. He goes into the machine, which he sees as kind of like a flying house, and encounters this tall being and also a small robot-like being as well. So a very powerful kind of experience. Also in 1978, in fact a few months earlier than Juan Perez's case in Argentina, I investigated a case in the New England area, a place called Bakers Creek Falls, and this is myself here standing at the lookout over Bakers Creek Falls, describing the vantage point that the witness had, who was a salesman driving a combi van. He'd come up from Melbourne, did some sales work on the north coast of New South Wales, was coming back, and then had this extraordinary set of experiences, missing time, and he pursues this object, and he follows it down into the remote Bakers Creek ravine area, and this fog, this strange fog that behaved erratically, just like in Juan Perez's case in Argentina a few months later. And he sees this object coming out of the fog, and then it would disappear into the fog and be like a little dome sort of cavorting around in the fog, and the fog seemed to be creeping up towards him kind of stuff. It was a really spooky case. It was one of the more impressive cases I investigated during that time. In actual fact, we were expecting a whole range of sightings because we were predicting a series of UFO sightings during that period, and it came to pass. It was a really interesting period. Now, a lot of academics, because of the resurgence of the UFO phenomenon in terms of the mainstream, are embracing this. One of the more interesting, and I'd almost call it a schizophrenic book myself in terms of the academic approach. But here's Diane Pilsuka, a religious scholar. She's written this book called American Cosmic, subtitled UFOs, Religion and Technology. And she kind of focuses on the potential of the UFO subject to be a modern day religion, a technological religion. And some of the stuff that she deals with is really interesting. A lot of the other stuff kind of left me a bit cold, and she also seemed to have a real passion for Jacques Vallée. She'd say, for Jacques, secrecy and camouflage are integral to the efficacy and persistence of this technological phenomenon. And in much the same way as technologies like social bots affect cultural change, that is completely under the radar of consciousness. What I found is she seemed to ignore the advice that Jacques Vallée himself gave to her, and that was, it is unwise to ignore the ontological aspects of the UFO. In fact, in other words, the reality, the physical aspects of the UFO phenomenon. There's a lot of social effects, there's a lot of psychic effects, but there's definitely a physical effect. And it was interesting that Vallée kind of cautioned her to pay attention to that as well. Because one of the things I had with her when I was talking to her about this was that her whole book focuses around her adventures with two anonymous people, James and Tyler. Well, her book and the details she describes about James and the references at the back pretty openly identify the person, James, who was a very high-level scientist in the United States. In fact, he comes in the story, but I won't be too specific. But also Tyler, there's sufficient information in the book to identify Tyler as well. And I put this to her, and she got fairly stroppy and with me. And already it was out there. It was kind of like an open secret. And I don't think she did her homework well in terms of disguising these people if that's what she wanted to do. Here's the story from the New York Times, and also got reported on the same day by Politico. And they are both mainstream newspaper sources in America. Once you get into the front page of the New York Times, it's kind of like that's mainstream. And back in the 16th of December 2017, here's the story. Real UFOs, Pentagon unit tried to know. And basically it revolves around this gentleman here down here in the lower right, Luis Elizondo, who was a member of the Defence Department intelligence guy, a very experienced guy running allegedly a secret Pentagon program. Now, for a subject that was dead and buried and had been killed off by the United States government, particularly with the Condon Report in 1969, you'd expect that why are they still studying UFOs? That raised a lot of eyebrows. Back in 1969, the Colorado University, under the direction of Dr. Condon, basically after 2.5 years and $500,000, issued a report, and the report said there was nothing of any scientific merit to the UFO subject. Move along, folks, nothing to notice here, better things to do with your time. And he even suggested that students who wanted to study the UFO phenomenon should be given demerit points to try and discourage them from studying UFOs, which was a bit of overkill. But anyway, here we have it. During the 2000s, from about 2006 through to 2012, thereabouts, allegedly Lou Elizondo was running this secret classified Pentagon UFO program. And heavily involved was this gentleman up on the right, Robert Bigelow, who was a Las Vegas multimillionaire who had this ongoing UFO interest. He was also very interested in technology that would help him get things like hotels into space and that kind of stuff. So he was right there at the forefront of a serious investigation of UFOs and putting a lot of his own personal money into it. Now, under the direction of Elizondo and company, it's alleged that they put out a request for any kind of aerospace type people to put submissions into this. Bigelow was the party that won the thing. I gather there was only a couple of submissions anyway, and quite a bit of money was spent studying the UFO subject, but the main focus of that program seemed to be to produce these I guess blue sky, advanced kind of project papers. They went under the acronym of DIRD documents. These were initially classified documents, basically summarising the cutting edge of technology with the idea of what we might be capable of in 50 years' time, with the view of seeing whether it involved technology that was being suggested by the UFO phenomenon. So it was a pretty interesting program. But the other thing that the paper really focused on, which really got everybody's attention, was a series of events that occurred off the coast of California and northern Mexico, mainly involving one of the biggest naval vessels in the US naval fleet, and that's the USS Nimitz. Now, the US Nimitz aircraft carrier doesn't go anywhere by itself. It's part of a large battle fleet, and they were off the coast of southern California and northern Mexico, basically doing a training workup in preparation to go to the Middle East. And it was during this that there was kind of a major encounter. There's been a whole series of events that have been going on for about a week. Part of the New York Times story and others and the things that quickly followed up highlighted the fact that a lot of this seemed to be facilitated by Tom DeLonge, who most people know as a rock musician, but most of us guys kind of knew he was a seriously obsessed UFO fan, but claiming that he was having high-level contacts with various military players. Now, I only really got interested in what he was saying when he mentioned a certain person's name, a General McCaslin, as one of his, up to that point, anonymous spokesmen or advisors. Now, McCaslin is about as high up as you can get within the military kind of technology game in the United States. And I'd come across McCaslin's name actually indirectly when I was writing a tribute piece for a Dr. Michael Duggan, who I knew, who worked for CSIRO during the 60s in Australia, went across to America. He was originally from America anyway, but he I interviewed him again later during the 80s, and then he seemed to disappear off the radar. And it turned out he was working for DARPA, which is the advanced technology kind of division of the American military. And he was still working for DARPA into his late 70s, passed away. And at the eulogy site, there was a tribute piece written by General McCaslin. Now, when I saw that name, I thought, fascinating. And then I realised that name had been leaked out courtesy of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange with all the emails of John Podesta, who was the person working with Hillary Clinton to try and get elected. You know how that kind of panned out. We ended up with somebody else who I won't refer to in this lecture, but essentially, well, I might actually, but McCaslin was a very highly placed player. Unfortunately, because of his outing in the Podesta emails, because Tom DeLonge was trying to work with Podesta to help facilitate leaking documents or making documents available, trying to get high-level players interested in it. But when McCaslin's name got out there because of the WikiLeaks documents, everything went quiet. The whole project went back in undercover again, and a whole series of new advisors came into play. Part of the game with this was that none of the advisors were meant to be named. And it's this case, the Nimitz case, that really started to focus people's attention, that got most of the general media's attention, because an extremely experienced pilot, Commander Faber, who was head of the flying battle group, he was doing the training exercise, coordinating it, and he had another pilot. There were two people on board each aircraft. And they were flying essentially one of the fastest planes in the US Navy arsenal, and they were doing a training exercise, and then that was interrupted by a request from the communications officer who was coordinating all the tracking and radar and that kind of stuff for the battle fleet, and said, what kind of ordnance do you have? Well, he thought that was a pretty strange question, because ordnance were weapons, because in a training mission you don't carry live ordnance because accidents happen, and therefore they want to eliminate that possibility. He says he's only got a dummy missile attached to it. What's going on? Anyway, they said they had a real world kind of event going on, and we need you to take a look at it. And so he was given the coordinates of one of these objects that had apparently been pacing the battle fleet for close to a week, seemingly operating often at 80,000 feet, and then would often drop down to almost sea level. And this has been going on, being tracked by the Princeton for about a week, and they were trying to figure out what these objects were. And then Faber and the other plane went to the coordinates. When they got there, they couldn't see any object or anything like that, or any aircraft. All they could see was massive disturbance about the size of 747 on the water, very still water. And then the next thing they noticed was that there was this strange little object. By little, they mean about 30 feet in diameter, which was pretty large, but seemed to be going like this, erratically all over the place above this disturbance of water. And it seemed to have two little L-shaped projections underneath it as well. Commander Faber elected to go down to engage with that object and started to go down in a spiral. And then it appears as soon as he started doing that, the object seemed to notice that he was coming, and it pivoted around and pointed towards him, and then it flew up straight past him at a phenomenal speed, and within less than a minute, it's gone over the horizon. And then he gets a call a few minutes later from the Princeton, from the communications officer, saying that you're not going to believe this, but this object's already arrived at your cap point, and that's an imaginary, well, basically coordinates. They're trying to set up a grid, a rectangular grid, in which the training exercise would take place. So it was a way of causing navigation, but somehow this object had arrived at that grid point and at a speed that was absolutely phenomenal. Now, Faber, certainly being a massively experienced pilot, was absolutely certain that this was a large, structured, solid-looking object. It was filmed in a subsequent deployment of one of the aircraft off the Nimitz, and that's the video that a lot of people have probably already seen. Now, given the involvement of Tom DeLonge's organisation, he went on to develop this organisation that had Lou Elizondo, the intelligence officer who subsequently quit his job in the Department of Defence, as a main player. But what puzzled me was that the hard detail and the analysis of the Nimitz case didn't come from Tom DeLonge's organisation, To the Stars Academy. It came from an organisation that I have a lot of respect for, and that's the Scientific Coalition of Ufology, and SCU, that was run by a friend of mine, Robert Powell, who used to be the former scientific director of the MUFON organisation. Now, the report itself is only about 20 or 30 pages long, but it's got about 150 pages worth of appendices, detailed analyses, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a report that I love to read. But it highlighted that despite the limited amount of data they had, there was enough core data in the information they had from the pilots and all the rest of the players, because a lot of people witnessed this or played a part in the whole series of encounters that took place, that they were able to report that this seemed to be an object that perhaps wasn't made here. They weren't going to go down the path of saying it was extraterrestrial, but it clearly had abilities and potentials that were way beyond what we seem to be capable of doing. So, interesting report. This just gives you an idea of the details, the size of the object. It was about the same size as the jet aircraft that Faber was flying. There is a video that's available on the internet, the Nimitz encounter. It's well worth having a look at it. It's an attempt to try and recreate the entire event called the Nimitz encounter. It's freely available. Now, we get to the heart of the matter, I guess. I mentioned To the Stars Academy. Now, Tom DeLonge, over here, well-known rock singer, but also well-known UFO enthusiast. He kind of had made a lot of money, and he wanted to form some sort of organisation that would act as a way of trying to legitimise the subject, act as a kind of a rallying point for the public, an attempt to re-educate the public, and also to try and make some sort of connection with the aerospace community, the intelligence community, the military community, and the political community, to try and, I guess in a word, rehabilitate the UFO subject. And he had some very interesting players join him. He had Dr. Hal Puthoff, who I'm sure some of our other lecturers will get into Hal Puthoff's career, but he was a well-known quantum physicist who had been involved in a lot of deep classified military research. In fact, from the 1970s, was one of the first to pioneer the remote viewing and psychic research stuff that was operating out under a project through the Stanford Research Institute. That was a cover for CIA-funded research into psychic phenomena and a main focus on remote viewing. Lou Elizondo, who I mentioned, the intelligence guy that quit in protest, he was part of this secret Pentagon group. He claimed that he was basically frustrated with the lack of sufficient resources being put into this project to monitor the subject. He felt there was a very serious problem involved that needed to be much more fully embraced by the military intelligence community. We had Chris Mellon, who was a former Assistant Secretary of Defence in the United States government. During his academic career, incidentally, he did a paper, a research paper while he was at university, and of all things it was focused on the Valentage case. This is the case in 1978 where a young pilot disappeared over Bass Strait under very unusual circumstances. Steve Justice, one of the head engineer, tech people from Area 51, and last but not least, Jim Semivan, who was probably one of the more clandestine players, a heavy-duty retired player from the CIA. So a lot of interesting people involved in Tom DeLonge's organisation. Lou Elizondo giving a lecture about TSA's operating divisions. There was field operations, collecting evidence of transformational technologies, evaluate sort of environmental conditions, record human effects, and there's science and aerospace, create a virtual community of interest to organise and analyse data, and also to attempt or to define concepts that exploit transformational technologies and transition technologies into viable products, that kind of thing. It was the final operating division that seems to have had the entire focus of To the Stars Academy at the moment. That is the education and entertainment to inform and inspire curiosity in the scientific kind of nature of the problem. And this has been the focus of what To the Stars Academy has been doing. Now, I've been for decades an advocate of open UFO research, multidisciplinary research, scientific kind of research, but I've got to say that To the Stars Academy is somewhat opaque, incredibly opaque, and fairly forthcoming when we're dealing with the media, particularly the media that don't ask hard questions, but less opaque with experienced journalists that I know of who have been trying to get detailed information out of To the Stars Academy. Now, one of the divisions was something called Project Adam, and that was to collect materials. And one of the focus of the New York Times story was that the Bigelow Corporation, who was being funded by this secret project to undertake this research into UFOs, had built facilities to house materials related to unidentified aerial phenomena or UFOs. Now, that seemed immediately became one of the high focuses of the media and the general public. Did they have a crashed UFO? That kind of thing. Now, they'd put out a public appeal, and there's been materials floating around the UFO community literally for decades. And this is a montage of some of the materials that they collected in a short time. Now, as part of their education program, they also launched this 6-part, or at least in season 1, History Channel program called Unidentified, Inside America's UFO Investigation. And they also did a lot of books, but what essentially they did was they launched a trilogy of books. That's the ultimate intention. Now, to date, the first 2 volumes of the fiction trilogy, that's the Secret Machines, Chasing Shadows, and A Fire Within, have come out, authored by Tom DeLonge and A.J. Hartley. Essentially, they're written by A.J. Hartley. And the same deal with the non-fiction trilogy. And I've just got a copy of the second one that's just come out. So they're coming out at a glacial pace, essentially, but about a year or 2 apart. And it's a trilogy called Gods, Man and War. The first volume, Gods, really went down, I guess, the ancient astronauts, ancient aliens path kind of stuff. Kind of essentially placed Earth as being involved in a cargo cult with the gods being presumably extraterrestrial or ultra-terrestrial or interdimensional, whatever. And in part 2, Just Our God, Man, is essentially delving on essentially 3 major areas, and that's genetics and the ET hypothesis, consciousness, and the human-machine symbiosis. Now, I mentioned Jim Semivance. Now, Jim Semivance is a key player within To the Stars Academy, but generally they don't roll him out very often. But during the launch of Volume 2, I was watching the launch via the internet, and he says one particular thing. What To the Stars Academy is doing is based on Peter Levender's work. Now, Peter Levender is the co-author with Tom DeLonge of the non-fiction trilogy Gods, Men and War, but essentially what's patently obvious is that it's pretty much Peter Levender's book, and perhaps guided by Tom DeLonge's kind of trajectory and awareness. Now, I don't know whether people are familiar with Peter Levender, but he's very well known for a book called Rat Lines, which sort of highlighted a conspiracy theory associated with the, well, I guess a network of Catholic priests and others and Nazi sympathisers that allowed various Nazi war criminals to get out of Germany and other places to gain sort of some more secure home in another country. It's controversial in that respect, but how I knew Peter Levender was particularly through this book's another trilogy, Sinister Forces, a grimoire of American political witchcraft. Book 1 was subtitled The Nine. Now, the problem with this is that the Nine refers to all this psychic channeling stuff going on in the days of Uri Geller and the person who brought Uri Geller to America, Andrea Paharic, a fairly controversial scientist who came out with a biography, so to speak, of Uri Geller that was almost guaranteed to fail straight away. It was a pretty weird book. And here's Peter Levender focusing on the Nine and their role in the political occult history of America, and yet he's the one that's doing this trilogy for Tom DeLonge's organisation, To the Stars. So a lot of questions there. So, and a lot of the occult narrative comes out in these books. In fact, volume 1 starts with this reference to the Nine, which kind of, I guess, undermines the credibility of it a bit. As I said, these players like Hal Puthoff and others, they kind of immediately make you think about what is the true agenda of To the Stars Academy. Well, I don't know because they're not really telling us, and I've had numerous attempts to try and contact these people, but they're not very forthcoming, other than their limited media statements. One of the key players I highlighted was Dr. Hal Puthoff, and one of his key people, Dr. Eric Davis, working at the Institute of Advanced Studies, which is Puthoff's organisation. And by the way, for those that are aware of Eric Davis, he's now left Hal Puthoff's organisation to join an aerospace organisation. Now, many of you might know or have heard of this document, the so-called Wilson documents, being referred to as the UFO leak of the century. Essentially what it was, it referred to a briefing or a conversation that Admiral Thomas Wilson had with Dr. Eric Davis. Now, neither Admiral Wilson or Dr. Davis will confirm the legitimacy of this material. Now, we've determined that they appear to be coming from the papers of the late Dr. Edgar Mitchell, one of the Apollo astronauts who walked on the moon, who also was very interested in paranormal research, who also happened to be born in Roswell and happened to have a lifetime interest in UFOs as well. And he openly would say that there was something definitely involved in the UFO subject, and it was a subject of merit, and he believed that the US government had retrieved crashed UFOs. Now this memo, or this document, the Davis-Wilson document, appears to be legitimate, and one of the people that was involved with the partial release of this is James Rigney, a fellow I know, a friend from Victoria. Now he's a really nice guy, but he had a twin interest in aerospace and UFOs, and that's what caused him to have access to this material. He was given this material. Apparently the Mitchell family weren't that keen to hold on to Edgar's UFO files, but others certainly were, and luckily much of it's been preserved. Now that, I guess, mother lode of material, this sort of stuff is starting to find its way into the UFO community. And of interest to me was the reference to the fact that at some point this stuff was so secret and the military was so prone to gaffes and leaks and stuff like that, they wanted to privatise the whole, I guess, UFO retrieval, UFO, I guess, attempts at re-engineering, back engineering, of crash UFOs and all that kind of stuff. And that really hit home for me because I'd been contacted by a party here in Australia that was telling me that he was one of the primary architects of this program, or at least the template that led to it becoming into the domain of non-military, non-government, that it was going into private aerospace hands, and that was the process that made it much more difficult to find out about these things. And that was the whole focus of the Davis-Wilson interaction, where Davis was talking to Admiral Wilson. Admiral Wilson was extremely high up in the military government hierarchy, briefing directly to the president, and he heard from various UFO researchers that there were these programs, special access programs, that were beyond the purview and review of the American government, and he said that he should be in the know, and yet he found that he wasn't in the know. And so he found after several months of inquiry the names of some of the parties involved, some of the aerospace companies, and when he contacted them, he was advised that he was not on a need-to-know basis. He says, how can I be not on a need-to-know basis? Because I report directly to the president. He says, well, the president's not on a need-to-know basis either. So that, according to this memo, made him extremely angry. Now, Wilson will not confirm that this happened, but there have been some other partial confirmations, but it's still got to be regarded as a unconfirmed document. But given that it came from Dr. Mitchell's files, I think there seems to be some suggestion that it's reasonably authentic. The other focus of To the Stars Academy and a lot of other players is the search for so-called metamaterials. This is what was referred to in the New York Times, this strange alloy or material. It was somewhat misdescribed in the New York Times piece, but essentially players either look at it as metamaterials or perhaps more appropriately ultramaterials related to UFO, or the new buzzword for UFOs, because UFOs has so much baggage. I still prefer UFO because we know what we're talking about, but UAP brings in all sorts of or unusual aerial phenomena or unidentified aerial phenomena, all that kind of stuff. Adds to the ambiguity of it still. But the main item that To the Stars Academy seems to be putting all its nest egg together with is this item here, which is mainly kind of a multi-layered bismuth material that's often referred to as arts parts, because it came from a well-known, now deceased radio guy who did a radio program in America, Art Bell. The thing about this, the problem that occurs here is it has already been previously studied, and they suggest that there is some sort of prosaic explanation for this, but now they're arguing that it's not, and there's claims that if you hit this with gigahertz of frequency, this thing will hover. Now, there's no seriously confirmable verification of that. All this is going on somewhat in secret within the To the Stars Academy. One of the players involved with To the Stars Academy, who's now seemingly withdrawn from To the Stars Academy, is Dr. Gary Nolan. I had some contact with him when he was examining, courtesy of Stephen Greer, the so-called Atacama mummy, this 6-inch little mummy that Greer believed was extraterrestrial. Well, Nolan's work certainly suggested that it wasn't extraterrestrial, that it was a heavily mutated embryo being, or person that had been born but had experienced massive mutation because of local pollution and that kind of thing, and it wasn't extraterrestrial. Gary Nolan and Jacques Vallée are now collaborating together to do much more peer review, much better studies of some of the materials that they have. And I suspect that one of them is this 1964 sample out of France, because Jacques Vallée's from France, called the Gateau material, which involved a gentleman who was saw what appeared to be some sort of large vehicle sitting in a paddock, scaring the cows. He goes over to investigate. This vehicle then takes off. It scares the hell out of him. He runs back to the car, and then later on he has enough courage to come back and finds a burnt area and about 6 pieces of this kind of material. And it's been subject to a fair bit of investigation study already, but it'll be interesting to see how more detailed analysis, particularly isotope ratio studies. I won't go into any detail to bore you with chemistry and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty rarefied stuff, but a lot of the focus will be on isotope ratios to determine whether these things are terrestrial or from out there or whatever. One of the other focuses that's come out of all this dance of various people is the search for biomarkers in high-functioning, intuitive people, particularly within the military community where you've got people performing extraordinary tasks under pretty heavy-duty kind of stress, and you need to be a highly functioning person to operate in that kind of stress environment, often under fire, that kind of stuff. And also it's focusing on so-called experiences or experiencers of UAP or UFO phenomena. Now, the key work here had been done by, over the last few decades, by Dr. Christopher Kit Green. And Kit Green has been a well-known player he used to work for the CIA at what was affectionately called their weird desk, which was essentially anything weird that fell out of the purview of the CIA that maybe had to do with UFOs, ghosts, paranormal, it often ended up on his desk. And so he was a real player, and he's now collaborating with Dr. Gary Nolan, who has well-established and highly credible biomedical labs in California. And they're studying this situation of potential biomarkers and also MRIs and that kind of stuff on people that have been either injured or exposed to radiation or whatever, what impact that has on those individuals. This particular MRI leaked out. I think it's pretty hard to find now, but it's so-called patient 1 month following near-field exposure to unidentified aerial craft at 500 metres. Patient died 2 weeks later. That's the information associated with MRI. So very controversial stuff, and some of it leaked out in this book, another book that focused on remote viewing phenomena by Annie Jacobson. Now, while it's incomplete in certain areas, it's a good overview of a very complex series of programs that occurred under the remote viewing banner through the US government. Well worth a read. Now here's the To the Stars Academy's Unidentified program. It's well worth a look at this, but essentially what you're getting over 6 episodes on the History Channel in the Unidentified program is the evolution of a threat scenario. And by the end of the program, they're dealing with the nuclear threat and also the suggestion of the idea that in Italy, in the island of Corsica, during a local investigation of mysterious fires that took place in Corsica, there was a suggestion that it was UFO related. Well, I think the evidence for that's pretty weak, but there was an individual who was in fact part of the Italian military who was briefing Tom DeLonge and Elizondo, and when I saw that program, I was just dismayed that they were focusing all their eggs on this particular case out of Italy because it's so weak. They suggested they had video footage or photos of a UFO firing a beam at a helicopter and knocking it out of the sky. Now that's what the military Italian guy said to Elizondo and company and Tom DeLonge over what appeared to be a classified or limited private meeting. Well, actually it was piggybacking off the back of a UFO conference in Italy, and that there was nothing classified about it, and that the photos don't in fact show that. It's not very credible evidence. But certainly the evidence for the nuclear connection is compelling. But what dismayed me was the program never even highlighted the research of Robert Hastings, who had produced a really excellent book that's had a couple of editions and also a documentary on his books called UFOs and Nukes. Definitely worth looking at. But what's quite amazing is that Robert Hastings is now, he's experiencing some illness problems, health problems, but he's come out with almost a confessional book. I think he actually calls it Confession or something like that, but it highlights the fact that, and he is concerned that this might affect the credibility of his work on UFOs and the nuclear connection, where UFOs apparently have infiltrated nuclear sites and shut down nuclear missiles, that kind of stuff. And but he's now saying that he's had lifelong alien abduction experiences, and one of the key witnesses that he's had has also had similar stuff as well. So that's a fairly interesting connection. Very much The Skinwalker Ranch that Bigelow had purchased and became a focus of the whole program, this classified Pentagon program. But when I first saw the Skinwalker book come out and the Utah UFO displays came out much earlier, it was like deja vu to me because I'd been experiencing stuff like that up on the Dorrigo Plateau. Anyway, a lot of stuff is coming out on this, really interesting stuff. During the research into the Skinwalker Ranch, there was a visit, a gentleman from the Defence Intelligence Agency, who it turns out, we know the guy's name, but it's not publicly available. It was a DA scientist and an intelligence guy who apparently was the first person to run the forerunner of the so-called ATIP program, which was the one that Elizondo is believed to have been running, but in actual fact it was run by this gentleman who requested through a senator who initiated part of this program and through Bigelow to go to the ranch because he wanted to see what was going on the ranch. He'd heard all these weird stories, had read the book by Cole Killiner and George Knapp, and he goes to the ranch and he's interviewing people. He's at one of the houses there and he has a personal experience of a Mobius-shaped thing that seemed to have some sort of hieroglyphics that appeared, and he's the only one who sees this. He's totally dismayed by it and he doesn't tell anybody, but that experience amazed him enough to go back to Washington and initiate further programs. So, very interesting. But that same guy, as it turns out, appears to have been forced out of the military based on the fact that there are players within the US military who see all this as demonic. From a strictly religious point of view, you know, these are people deep within the US military and the intelligence community that apparently gave this guy a nightmarish time, virtually forced him out of the military community because he wanted to scientifically investigate the UFO subject. The other big thing is, I mentioned the biomarkers that Dr. Gary Nolan and company had been researching. Well, a popular researcher, Eric Deluxe, started interviewing this gentleman, Chris Marks, who it's been confirmed that he was a security guard. He's got a lot of heavy-duty credentials within the US defence community, and he was employed by the Bigelow organisation to operate as a security guard on the facility. Now, he had a whole stack of material which he's been releasing now, which is Skinwalker Ranch data, reports that he saw a shape-changing man transforming into a wolf. These are the tracks that he confirmed. A really bizarre story. He also took a lot of the experimentation, which was already taking place, into pretty weird areas, like a Ouija board experiments where the Ouija board, the thing that you use, was flying off and hitting him in the chest during experiments that occurred on the ranch. Pretty weird time. But he also highlighted that there was medical monitoring of these security people. But there's a lot of evidence for the paranormal connection with UFOs, and this is part of my own journey through it with old Ian McRae, the radio announcer that gave me tapes that he'd done with an English woman who had an abduction experience. While dealing with her, the technician associated with Ian McRae developed psychic powers and was able to bend forks while interviewing this woman, that kind of thing. I wrote about it in the 60s, or the 70s rather, and 80s. This is a range of psychic cases. Now, I think most of this will be put up on my website as well, if you want to get details. But the two key areas to me was Mount Butler up near the University of New England and TYRINGHAM, which were like, I don't know, early versions of the Skinwalker Ranch. It was seriously weird stuff going on there. My own personal UFO sighting, same day in the evening, an apparitional encounter which seemed to possess a person staying on a property outside of Armidale, UFOs, multiple objects, mysterious demon skull type things turning up in photographs on that particular location. My own favourite area in Australia, TYRINGHAM. It seemed to be a real UFO hot zone there for a while, particularly during 1973. I even witnessed stuff myself. These are some of the photos or drawings as well. Weird sort of prophetic phenomena, auditory phenomena going on. A lot of paranormal detail. For detail, I suggest you go to my blog site in due course. And this was a personal encounter that I had with another gentleman on the property, and also extreme paranormal kind of case that involved myself, which I'll go into detail on my website. A haunted railway crossing in the area near Tyringham at Tullawudgie Crossing. The story was that if you went to that location, depending on which way you went across the crossing, you have a object shaped like a black rectangle with 4 lights coming out at you, or if you came through from the other direction, it'd be an apparition of a ghost, or a ghost coming across that intersection. So of course, us being us, we would go to that location. We were busily going backwards and forwards over that location for weeks, but nothing happened, basically. But the locals were experiencing all sorts of things. So that's me there trying to recreate the ghosts. So we know about Valet. And even cases as complex as Peter Curie's case with the hair sample, which we did a lot of DNA work, has a lot of psychic overtones. But there's been a litany of psychic stuff associated with Peter Curie's case. Some of it I described in the book Hair of the Alien, and others on my blog as well, even down to apparitional stuff that was really bizarre, a flying creature that seemed to perch on Peter's shoulder. And what startled me was that it seemed to correlate almost perfectly to a case of a Polish psychic in a seance back in 1919. Now, Peter had no idea of that case, but I did, and I drew it to his attention and it blew his mind. Again, an abduction case with a lot of psychic stuff, but also with a lot of physical stuff here in Liverpool, with a possible implant. And also, we have what appears to be a phantom fetus. That fetus was taken from the same woman and seemed to have been removed before birth. So, very interesting. But these are the kind of things that happen within the UFO phenomena. So, details on my website. And the other site that I find interesting, Alien DNA Paradigm. Check them out. I know it was a rough journey, but a lot of stuff to cover.